So this video is just a very brief video as to how the cell cycle regulates. It does not go very in depth at all. So to start with, I start with a very simple example. So if you remember in the video on the cell cycle, spindles are things that form during prophase. Now the reason spindles form is because a specific protein gets injected into the cell, and then that protein kind of tells the cell what to do at that point. So the protein is called cyclin here. So these proteins again are responsible for regulating the cell cycle. So here's a graph with just an example. So on the y-axis, you have the concentration, so how much of this protein do you have, and on the x-axis, you have some of the different steps in the cell cycle. So just by looking at this, you can see that cyclin D, that specific protein, starts here in G1 phase, and you actually needed the entire time that you're going through the cell cycle. Of course, you can see it's used in different amounts, so sometimes you have more of it based on whatever's going on in that specific step, sometimes you have less of it. Some of these proteins don't come until later on, so such as cyclin B doesn't start till S phase, or cyclin E ends during S phase and you won't have it again. So this just kind of shows an example of these proteins and when they show up and how much of them are showing up to be able to regulate what's going on with the cell cycle. All right, so now let's look at two types. So you have the internal and then the external. So we're looking at external. External means outside. So these are the proteins responsible for regulating things outside of the cell. So a brief example would be when a cell needs to replicate to divide when healing a wound. So the wound occurs, if you have a cut, for example, that occurs outside the cell. So then these would be proteins that are specifically, their purpose is to regulate the stuff because of things that happen in the outside environment, in that external environment. Internal regulators would go with inside. So this happens, so for example, it says the cell won't enter mitosis until DNA has been replicated. So you saw on the previous slide that you have several proteins that show up within the cell cycle inside of the cell to start working through some of those things that need to get done during each of those steps. So eventually cells will die. Now cells can die in one of two ways, okay? So it can either be an accident, so there's some sort of damage or injury to the cell because of something that occurs in your life, and so it dies by accident, or when it doesn't die by accident, eventually it reaches that point and it is programmed to die. So right now we're going to kind of go into a little bit of detail as to how a cell dies by programming. So programmed cell death is known as apoptosis. So a cell does undergo a series of controlled steps that lead to this self-destruction or this programmed cell death. So first of all, the cell and the chromatin shrink, then the cell membrane begins to break off. Lastly, macrophages, which are these special cells, will clean up the dying cell's remains. Now this name, most of the time I've heard it pronounced apoptosis. There have been a few times that I hear apoptosis or apoptosis or apoptosis. So if you hear one of those other ones, it's still referring to the exact same thing. So again, this is just the programmed cell death. This is normally the way cells will die over the course of their life cycle. Here is just a brief picture of what's going on during apoptosis, which is this, again, this programmed cell death. So you have your normal cell here, then eventually cell shrinks, different things start happening as you go through it until finally you're pretty much just at the end and the cell no longer exists. All right, now what happens when the cell doesn't die, either by a natural cause or through apoptosis? Well, one thing that can happen is it can lead to cancer. So cancer is caused by defects in the genes that regulate the cell growth and division. So these regulating genes that are supposed to go through each step and do exactly what the cell needs, whenever there's a defect, when something's going wrong, it could lead to cancer. So most cancer cells have a defect in gene P53, which is supposed to stop a cell from continuing with cell division until all the chromosomes have been replicated properly. So what should happen is if something happens during the replication of the DNA here, if there's errors or something, this specific gene should stop it from going on to the next step because obviously there's been an error, there's been a mistake. However, there's a defect there, it won't stop and it'll just continue through the process of the cell cycle. So cancer cells cannot respond to the regulators that control cell division, okay? Because again, there's a defect, so they don't know how to respond to those specific proteins, like cyclin A and B and so on, that tell it what to do. So cancer cells will start to divide indefinitely, and then because there's so many of them and obviously they need nutrients, they're going to absorb all those nutrients that are needed by the other cells that are around it. So when a cell divides nonstop, they form what we call a tumor, which is just a mass of cells. So you have two types of tumors. So when the mass of cells are non-cancerous, these are known as benign tumors, and when the mass of cells is cancerous, these are known as malignant tumors. Now, mal right there, those three words, that means bad. All right, so just remember that's the bad one. That's the one you definitely don't want. This is the cancerous tumor right here. So again, this is what can happen when your cell cycle is unable to regulate itself. All right, so here's just step one of something that could be happening. So again, cells are constantly replicating and dividing. Well, a cell can begin to divide abnormally, again, because there is a defect in the genes and it's unable to respond to some of these proteins that regulate the different steps in the cell cycle. Eventually, the cancer cells produce, again, what we call a tumor, which is just that massive cell, which you see right there in the picture. So this begins to displace or push out of the way all these normal cells and these normal tissues. And again, they start to absorb all of these nutrients. So all the cells that you see all throughout here, because this thing, I mean, everything, your entire body is made of cells. So all of this, they all need nutrients. But if you have this unregulated cell growth and you have this mass of cells, which shouldn't be there, you shouldn't have that many cells, obviously there's going to be a lot of nutrients that are unable to get to other cells, healthy cells that do need them. And then lastly here, cancer cells are particularly dangerous because of their tendency to spread once they enter the bloodstream or lymph vessels. So the cancer then moves into other parts of the body and forms secondary tumors, a process called metastasis. So in this case, as you can see here, eventually the tumor gets so large and it just keeps pushing all these other cells out of the way that one or more of these cells enter the bloodstream. And if you know, the bloodstream is a system of vessels, if you will, that kind of go all throughout your body, sending nutrients and all these things that your body needs or getting rid of things that your body doesn't need. And so in this case, what's happening is now this cell right here is going to be transported to other parts of your body where it can produce these secondary tumors and eventually can create more tumors. And this is what happens when cancer spreads throughout the body. So if you don't catch it quick enough, that is one of the possibilities.